the working class rising up. This is the ruling class punching down.
My day, bigger your day.
First rule of gladiator school, bro. Don't punch down.
Charging into a goblin's Hail, Trump!
The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within.
Control your own body.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
We can fight the entire banking system. Nobody can. But together, everybody can.
I did nothing wrong.
Hello, and welcome to Did Nothing Wrong Live, the show that cuts through the noise and helps you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke, and with me is Karl Folk. In today's episode, we talk about the massive No Kings protests that took place all over the world on Saturday, June 14th, and our experience on the ground at our local protests. We also talk about what it means that the state, as well as the right wing, have stepped up the level of violence, and whether that's likely to have a radicalizing effect. Thanks again for your support. Keep listening to learn more, and remember, smash those like and subscribe buttons like the LA cops on horseback did to the peaceful protesters on Saturdays. Karl, I know I say this every week, but what a fucking week.
Yeah, it's one of those weeks where centuries happened, and it just, I truly, like, this was one of those weeks that we're gonna see in books for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
From the time we recorded last week, and I had come back from the ground here in Minneapolis to now, it has been a major acceleration, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like not just in fascist violence against civilians, but like in the population's pushback. Yeah, we're in the middle of it. Yesterday here in Minnesota, we woke up to the news that 2 members of our legislature had been shot in an assassination attempt in one case, and a carried out assassination in the other, by a extremely right-wing shooter.
What looks at this point to be a guy who ran a security company, who was tied in with the New Apostolic Reformation, and he dressed as a cop. That's the scary part. This guy was dressed as a cop. He was driving what sounds like a police cruiser. He showed up at somebody's door, knocking on the door, saying, "I'm a police officer." They showed up, and he shot them from the sounds of things.
Yeah, no, I mean, truly, the images that have come out from like the security cams at the home, this is a guy wearing, kind of police-esque garb, wearing a skin-tight mask, a silicone mask, and driving a Ford, what looked to be a Ford Explorer Police Interceptor.
Right.
With a light bar. And,
right.
Yeah, it appears he ran a security company, and, multiple members of law enforcement in the family, et cetera. And, this is really, for myself, as someone who's, talked deeply and written pretty heavily about authoritarianism, but specifically like the gray zone warfare that goes on with modern authoritarians of certain kinds.
Right.
This would fall into that category. When you're using law enforcement style garb and driving a police cruiser style vehicle, and you're doing political assassinations, and they're clearly political assassinations, we're in a whole new world.
The guy had a list of political targets. He had everybody from like Ilhan Omar to various other, Minnesota state legislature politicians.
Yeah, and I mean, he had abortion offices, right? Like this really, and with the NAR Christian component, this feels a lot like, if you're old enough, what was happening in the 80s and 90s.
Right, with Operation
with
Rescue.
Abortion clinics. Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk for 1 second, just in case you aren't familiar with the New Apostolic Reformation. It's a group that is essentially what we would refer to as dominionists. They have a idea that they should be in charge of society. They are very definitely Christian supremacists. They believe in something called Seven Mountains theology, which means they believe that they should take over all parts of culture, from entertainment to the law, to the schools, to the judiciary. They want to go ahead and run everything. Yeah. These are the people that absolutely want a theocracy, and they're not pulling any punches about it. There's an episode of Straight White American Jesus that just dropped on Sunday with a breakdown of what the New Apostolic Reformation are. We'll link to that. It'll be definitely enlightening if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah.
The one piece of practical advice I think we should probably give people is, going forward, if the police knock on your door at 3:00 in the morning, you should call 911.
Yes.
And you should
don't
ask
open
the
fucking door.
dispatcher at 911 if they
Yeah.
really actually have somebody at your house. If
Yeah.
this is a legit thing, they'll be more than glad to tell you, oh yeah, there's
Mm.
actually a cop here. Okay. If it isn't, if they say it isn't, we'll say, well, guess what? Somebody's here pretending to be a cop. Can you send somebody?
Yeah. No, and that goes not just for this kind of thing, but like for federal officers too. If you
Right.
have federal agents show up at your door purporting to be federal agents, yeah, do the same thing,
Mhm.
right? Like call the cops, have them confirm, because what we're starting to see, right, is exactly what a lot of us warned about from
Yeah.
the kind of counter right wing and counter violent side is the commingling now of truly like just outside the box bad actors.
Yeah.
Because of the adoption by federal forces of a totally unregulated paramilitary style dress code,
Mhm.
we're starting to see that ripple, right? And that was always the concern here, was that the minute you have, kind of irregular forces,
Yeah.
other people are going to mimic that and use that.
And it's not difficult to do.
Yeah, I can go buy a gator for $12 on Amazon.
Uh-huh.
That's the exact same gator as the guys who pulled tasers and maced us on Tuesday of
Right.
a couple weeks ago,
Right.
right? Like, for a couple $100, you can look exactly like an ICE officer or a cop, right?
And I think really the main thing here is to say that since this is where they've decided they wanted to take it, we need to start looking at receipts every single time this happens. If they
Yeah.
show up, if they want to, know what you're doing, if they want to knock on your door in the middle of the night, you need to see a warrant. You need to see a receipt for that. You need to see a reason for why they would be doing that.
Yeah.
Ring cams are cheap. You can buy them relatively inexpensive these days. You can talk to
Well,
somebody through the door without having to open it. You can ask them what's going on. You can do all of this without personal contact at all at this
well,
point.
and this gets to the real, something that we haven't talked about tons and doesn't get talked about tons, but I think is really important in this context, which is like fascism. The actual thing that we're living with is this, right? The new norm in a fascist society is that it is inherently dangerous. It's inherently violent. It's inherently unreasonable. And it's going to continue to be that in differing shades. That's just the reality now, right? Like 80,000 Minnesotans decided to do the thing that you have to do in that situation, which is step out together. And that's the reality, right? Like we don't get through this by being cowed by people who want to hurt us, because that's how they win.
And big props to everybody in Minnesota who came out in the face of that, because it's scary all of a sudden that state legislators and local politicians are getting targeted literally by fanatics who are opposed to what's going on right now. And, the police, the organizers, everybody said, let's cancel this thing, because the guy supposedly had flyers in his car that said he was going to No Kings. So let's go ahead and cancel this thing out of an abundance of caution, make sure no one gets hurt. And people said, no, sorry.
Yeah.
We're going to show up anyway. We're going to show up, and 80,000 of y'all did. So props.
Well, and some of the signs that you saw, like I didn't take as many photos yesterday as I normally do, because I didn't want to get photos of people's faces. I think
Sure.
increasingly that might be risky now.
Mhm.
And some of the signs that you saw are heartbreaking. But also, this is the resolve we all have to have.
And we had it. And we had
it's
it.
never not been with us, right? Like we're just relearning it.
Yeah.
It's something we've all had forever in us. It's part of the cool thing about this country and what we really are, right?
Right.
Which is people who truly do want the best for one another and want to stand with other people to say this isn't okay. And, ultimately, I think we all are learning to walk through the fear and that we can't do it alone. And so like that for me, I have some real feelings about these protests in the long term. I've
Right.
made those very clear. I don't shy away from them. The one avenue that I see these protests being the most useful is their permission giving structure. There's something that give more and more people the permission to say this isn't okay and to step outside of a box that they've always been in.
Right.
Also an avenue to funnel people to other things that they might never have been exposed to before, and that opens doors. That's where these protests are incredibly important.
Hmm.
They bring us together, they show community, they show that we're all together. They start to bring out mutual aid. People start to share what others need.
Right. And I've
But
seen a variety of estimates about how many people showed up yesterday, anywhere between 4 million to somebody claiming 11 million. The actual
Mhm.
number is probably somewhere between 6 and 7 million. And if that's
Yeah,
the case, we're
that's a
looking at
huge
1.5% of the US
yeah,
population that
yeah.
showed up. And that's extremely impressive when you consider that this isn't being driven by the establishment Democrats. I mean, the closest thing you're seeing to an establishment Democrat here is people from like Indivisible. And
Right.
that's, this other advocacy group that really is sort of operating outside the whole thing as well. So
Yeah,
you're
well,
not
and I think
seeing this being driven by, the usual suspects. And it's very clear that maybe some of this stuff was astroturfed in the beginning, but it isn't now.
well, and I think what's interesting about this week in looking at that, right, is seeing how certain parts of, let's say, like, maybe the corporate resist side of, like, the liberals apparatus was trying to really, astroturf really dangerous advice into the movement prior to the action yesterday. And, telling people to sit down if they're getting charged by police, things like
Right.
that. Just the most unbelievably dangerous stuff possible. And initially, it was really problematic because it did look like it was coming from leaders and whatnot. But, after a couple of days of that, it was very clear that this was coming from a different part that wasn't actually part of those protests. And, for me, I know myself, friend of the pod, Jared Yates Sexton, some other people really, had hammered on that because that's an incredibly dangerous situation where you have, you know, bad actors starting to feed information into what is ostensibly or was a, separate movement.
Right.
And I think, for myself and for other people who have, watched this happen a few times, uh, the concern is there's a recuperative effort, right? Where if the Democrats are involved at a high level, it's a recuperative effort to maintain a system and tamp down actual energy that might be requesting real systemic change.
Right.
And I think that's a fair and valid critique. I think that, I mean, for me, that's where I come from.
Right.
But I also understand that on the pragmatic side, this is a great entry point for millions of people into something that they've probably never done before, were scared shitless about, and then did it. And that's incredibly important in these moments.
Right.
And for me, mass movements, and I've said this before here, are good in that they allow this kind of thing to happen. We can't rely on them solely as our sole means of achieving victory over fascism,
No.
but they are a great and important point to work from.
And I think that
And
those people who seem to think that people like you and me are saying that this isn't important should really listen to what we're saying right now, which
yeah,
is they are important. They have their place. This isn't
exactly.
the
And
only thing you can do. You
exactly.
have to do other things now. Once you've gotten to the point where you feel like, hey, I can go out to a protest. I can go out and, make my voice heard with my neighbors. I live in a small suburb north of Seattle, and we had probably close to 2,000 people out
Which is
for
huge.
that.
Yeah, which
And,
is huge.
no violence. Everything was peaceful. There
Yeah,
was a few signs that were a little edgy, but that's really about it. For the most part, it was a very
yeah.
resisty kind of crowd out there. And you know what? There were more of them than there were the first time they did this. And there
Oh,
will
yeah.
probably be more the next time.
Yeah.
And that's how this starts. You're going to get a groundswell of people who now feel like, hey, this wasn't so bad. I stepped off the curb. I took that first step into what potentially might be activism. And now I'm ready to maybe do some other things.
Yeah.
And this is
That's
another
exactly right.
I mean, this is another thing I want to seg into is that, like, we saw what looked like a very escalated response, not just on the part of people like the shooter in Minnesota, but on the part of the police. We saw another incident also in Salt Lake City where somebody opened fire. We saw somebody in Richmond, Virginia, I believe it was, drove a SUV into a crowd. We saw the right and the police in Los Angeles and in Portland decide that they were going to step up the level of response.
Yeah. No, and I think last night, I said something last night, and it seems to have had some, real resonance, which is like the police rioted across the country last night. And in LA specifically, it was a fucking war zone.
It was.
Right.
You had the sheriffs and the LAPD gassing each other. Right? Best of luck to both sides. But
aim, like, this is the one time I'll tell them both to aim higher than chest
shoot
level.
straight, guys, shoot straight.
Yeah. No, it's one of those things, like, this is the tough argument, right? And I think for people on my side, and for anyone who's really looked at this and said, what are we doing? How do you reconcile that police violence against peaceful protesters with, we have to get back to a system where that's what we've always done?
Right.
Like, we can't, like, these things can't continue, right? And this is the argument that happened in 2020 that got ultimately swamped with not that argument, right? Well, like, part of the argument in 2020 was like, police are dangerous as hell, and they're right-wing forces that will attack you for no reason.
Yeah.
They'll murder minorities in the street without repercussion.
And I think it's also clear that one of the things I hear constantly on, Blue Sky and Twitter is, why aren't these big city mayors like Karen Bass, for instance, of LA, doing something about these people? And my personal theory is that they can't, because the average big city mayor is not in charge of their own police department. The average big city mayor does not have the stroke to be able to tell the cops stand down in a situation like this.
Well, and that's one of the hard realities, right? Like, this is the argument that's been going on that led to 2020, that was put aside for the entirety of the Biden administration, which is like, the police are their own force. They are a right-wing force of violence that is directed at minorities and the poor, because the goal isn't public safety. It's to protect and serve the wealth class and white supremacist power structure.
Yeah.
Right. And that is just a born fact that, on the sociology side, we can talk about it for days. On the like the poli-sci side, days of conversation. But that's just the reality. And so when you're in a situation where that's the case, people have to really, if we want to be done with this, we have to actually fight to be done with it. And that means we can't go back and say, well, these protests were so powerful that we have to give up on looking at for better, because this will bring us back to status quo.
Right. And I think that people are kind of starting to get that, because again, like Spencer Sunshine, who we've had on the pod a number of times, great guy, has a great comment yesterday about this on Blue Sky. He said, other than maybe the women's marches, this is the first time I've ever seen a major street protest movement in the US clearly led by liberals and not leftists. And he's actually right about this. These protests are very resisty in their character. And that's a good thing, because it's, number one, a heretofore untapped source to some extent of street protest energy. And number two, when the police step up their violence against the protests, picture this. You're at a place like, say, for instance, Edmonds, Washington, right? bucolic as fuck. Nice,
Yeah.
calm, peaceful, nothing's going on. You have Rick Steves, who does those amazing PBS documentaries as your keynote speaker because he lives there.
Shout out to Rick, by
Rick
the way,
Steves.
for
What's up,
being
buddy?
one of the realest ones out there forever.
You have Rick Steves out there, you know, basically kind of leading the whole thing. And, you know, everything's chill. You have some people with your, you know, pictures of Donald Trump as a lion with the Lion King signs and shit like that. It's great. And that's when the police come down.
Yeah.
What is that going to do to the psyche
of
some of these people? They know they weren't violent. They know they weren't rioting. And all of a sudden the cops come in. You've got kids. How do you explain that to the kids? Well, we were just exercising, you know, our First Amendment rights to speech here. You know, literally the thing that's the first line of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. And the cops came in on horseback and cracked our heads for it. Yeah. What does that do to a resist lib psyche?
Right. Well, and that's the thing. They're going to start to look for
We're going to find out.
They're looking for answers, right? Like what I've really seen, you know, is like there are two things going on right now. Online specifically and in the real world, but more specifically online. That's the fight going, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked about the fact that like neoliberalism as an embodiment of white kind of moderate policy.
Right.
Is dead. And that as it fully is shown to be a dead ideology, it's going to rage against the dying of the light. And what we're seeing is that beginning, right? Like for a lot of people, these protests are an entry point. They're also, you know, going to further people, as we said, their ability to go out and do more. But what they're really doing is the thing that you said, is they're setting certain people up to now question what they've been told is the norm versus the reality they experienced on the ground.
Yeah.
That dissonance.
You've heard the expression, a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. And you've heard the expression, you know, a radical is a liberal who's been arrested.
Yep.
And you find yourself thinking like, you're making radicals here. You are building a generation of radicals by clamping down the authority on people who know damn well they're not doing anything that should result in their heads getting cracked. And that creates a very teachable moment, a very, wow, my mind is very open to the possibility of why all this stuff might have happened. What caused these people to do this, to the point where, like, for instance, in 2020, when people were saying abolish ICE, everybody thought that was some kind of radical, wild-eyed solution.
I got called a literal Bolshevik radical for saying that.
And now, like, abolish ICE seems to be a pretty mainstream Democratic position. It's like, oh, now that they're actually like handcuffing senators and, you know, arresting Congress people for asking questions, now you find yourself thinking, maybe those people during the first Bush administration who said that DHS was a bad fucking idea all the way down had a point. I was one of them. And you find yourself thinking like the Overton window moves both ways. The Overton window has moved to a point where violence is very acceptable for right wingers, but the Overton window has moved to a point where the stuff that was being said in 2020 that everybody thought was controversial from the left is not very controversial anymore.
No. And I think, you know, people want answers, right? Like ultimately it's why we've seen so much of certain parts of like the online Democratic contingent get so deep into conspiracy theory, right? And why so many of them have been radicalized by bad actors, whether the conspiracy theorists or not. Because like the Republicans in 2008, they were looking for an answer as to why things haven't gotten better, even though they keep doing what they're told.
Yeah.
Right. Like ultimately, you know, like they've set up something where these people are getting worse results. And so they're searching for answers as to why that happens. So you know, like we've talked about the radicalization element within certain parts of this before. This is part of that, right? And like the neoliberal urge is to recuperate the energy, to tamp it down and to repackage it in a way that's consumable, but also very much neutered of its actual, maybe more radical energy.
Right.
It doesn't, that's how this feels to me as someone who's watched this before, but it also seems to be working against them ultimately for that reason that you said, right? Like if you get gassed as like as a first time protester, like if you're in downtown LA last night and y'all were dancing in the street, having yourself a bacon wrapped hot dog, which by the way, I am dying for seeing them on the streets and having not had one in like 2 years. Different story. That's a moment for a lot of people where it's going to raise true questions about systemic stuff. And that's important because the systemic stuff is actually how we are going to achieve a future that's better for all of us, is to address those systems and really look at how we have to either hatchet them and rebuild them, or what we have to do in those cases, because there are going to be situations, ICE, for example, DHS,
Right.
they're just going to go.
They have
don't need them. We don't need them, and everyone involved needs to sit in a jail cell for a while. And the reality is, like, we've never done the hard work of actually dealing with the white supremacy problem or the colonial supremacist problem or any of this. And it's because these same forces throughout our history have told us to moderate versus doing the hard work of actually rooting it out. It happened after the Civil War when we ended Reconstruction due to white terror and capitulation with it. It happened after, look at Red Summer in 1921. Look at what happened during the Wilmington coup, where white folks decided that black people had too much power, so they couped the entire town, ran people off, and murdered them. And this is a reoccurring theme in our history, right? And I think I said this before, which is like America has a reactionary moderate core that would much rather moderate away from real, true, positive change for the most people to the easier route, which is saying that these are impossible things to do, and we would rather maintain what we have.
Yeah.
And that is it's starting to become stronger, right? Like people are feeling it, that something got screwed up here. And again, everyone's just looking for an answer. And I think, for most people, the goal is to find something that's going to tell them why.
Right.
And these protests are a great avenue for that. I don't want to see people getting gassed, beat, shot, any of that. And for most people on the ground, if they experience that, they're going to make that next step on their own, which is the only way this happens.
And the thing is, when people ask, well, so if you think a lot of this stuff is theater, why are you there? Why are you actually at this protest? Why do you go and shout at empty buildings?
Yeah.
Well, because I'd kind of like to be the person who gets the chance to explain to these people what's going on.
It's exactly it, right? Like I go to these in part to cover them a lot of times. This time I was going to take photos, but I really, after what had happened in the morning, I just said, I can't.
Right.
Not right. And yeah, the thing I go for is this, as a sociologist and as someone who really likes understanding how people work as groups, looking and seeing and talking to people, asking people what made you come out today? And getting a response where it's like, well, for example, I got a response where it was like, my sister's on Medicare. She was injured in a work-related injury and she can't work anymore. They're going to kick her off. She deserves dignity.
Yeah.
Like getting, people get it, right? Like the basic thing for all of us is dignity. There's basics there: dignity, our right to be fucking free, all these things. And like, we don't need to overthink those things. That's what we're here for, right? Like, and so if we can present that, right, like along with this is good because you're here, but it's also not enough.
Yeah.
That's real power. And for myself, like, I don't want you to be radical. I want you to be happy. And that's the end of the day, right? Like if like I want you to be in a, like all of us, right? Like I think ultimately the goal is we want to solve problems because we want everyone to have the same life that they deserve just because they're a human. No one deserves anything different because they're a different human. Fuck that. And it's the and that's just it, right? Like we have to really embrace that. We're all just humans doing human stuff.
We are. We absolutely
Republicans and the fascists, we have to sort them out because they're not in the same category. They don't see us as human. And so this is a different thing. Like with the neoliberal core and that recuperative effort, that's working towards something that doesn't see us
as human beings.
Well, as equals.
No.
They see us as 3/5. And that's the problem, right? Like we have to get away from any of this where it's some people deserve and some people don't. Everyone deserves the same chances. Everyone deserves the same laws. Everyone deserves the same rights. Everyone deserves to live a life of dignity. And that should be our end goal, not technocratic maintenance, not what's the most financially savvy way to lift people out of poverty when we could just give them universal basic income.
Right.
Like there's so many places where we can choose to walk forward because that's the thing to do for the most amount of people and give the most amount of people the dignified life they deserve because they're humans.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the point that I'd like to get across to everybody here is that I don't think you think that the liberals are the enemy any more than anybody else who's approaching this problem in good faith is the enemy.
Right.
There are people who up until 2017, 2016 had never really confronted the idea that this was something that could happen.
Yeah.
And I'm personally not interested in collecting dues or receipts or any of that.
Absolutely
Once you get
not.
on board, stay on board.
Yeah.
Welcome to the party. Here is what we have done so far. Here is why people feel the way they feel about some of this kind of stuff. Here's some theory. But for the most part, I'm perfectly willing to welcome anybody who has decided that it's time for this guy to go. The best example of this is Bill Kristol, I think.
Thank you. You took my example. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's this guy who for years has been this conservative, very like almost right wing.
Yeah.
He's done all of this journalism, Weekly Standard, all of this other stuff. But he takes a look at Trump and says, fuck no. This is And he's been very militantly opposed to Trump ever since. And it's funny because you look at it now and he's on the good side on things like trans rights. He's on the good side on things like gay rights. And I think he's evolved. And to some extent, part of that is being around the people who are against the Trump thing, because you're going to get exposed to different ideas over here.
Yeah.
I'm very much of the opinion that we should grab people wherever they are when they've had that road to Damascus kind of moment of, man, this is not a good idea.
Yep.
And then say, hey, welcome to the party. Here's some other stuff. When you get a chance, check this out. I'm not really down with purity testing people at this point. We need all the help we can get. We need the biggest tent. We need the popular front. I'm a big fan of that whole concept. And
when you know me, like I've been one to call for this for a while, where it's like, I don't think anyone should be expected to come into a new frame of thinking about the world and be expected to be right at the same level that people who've been bathed in it for a long time are going to be at, right? Like that's not how this works. You have to, for people, like as long as you come in good faith and you want to hear it out, even if you disagree and it's in good faith, that's awesome. Yeah. That is the thing that democracy is, right? And what we run into with anything, whether it's politics or whatever, in online spaces is people who want to act in bad faith and decontextualize arguments, make things into something they're not, and then attack not the claim, but the person, right? And we've seen a lot of that this week, and like I've been dealing with it, as you know, and
Yeah.
it's really indicative of this thinking where anything that's seen as critical is a threat. That's dangerous. We can't keep doing that. We have to do this commingling, kind of multidisciplinary, big air quote, thinking that comes from being around people you may not have ever been around, ideas you may not agree with or have ever heard of, let alone agree with. And like, that's where the power of these protests is, right? Like,
Yeah.
when I say, you know, like online, oh, this is, you know, what does this achieve? Politically, I don't know. I have some real feelings about that. What it really achieves, though, is this thing, which is the more powerful part, which is the actual ground building of people interspersing, ideas coming together, groups. You know, yesterday I saw a lot of groups that were obviously leftist, whether they were communist or socialist or anarchist, sometimes hard to tell. But they were doing what they were doing at the first rally, which is they were talking to people. They were handing out candy.
Yeah.
You know, they were doing the things that you do. And that is the power of these mass protests. They're not, this isn't going to be direct action. As much as I would love it to be, and as much as I know others would, these mass protests aren't going to be direct action in the way that you have to
No.
approach sometimes with fascists. But they open the door to many other things down the road because of that commingling. And that is the stuff that democracy was born of, right? Is these chaotic moments where there are huge groups of people reflecting those different ideas and different thoughts of what could be. How do we approach this problem? What do we look at? How do we
Right.
see this? And that's where the beautiful stuff comes from, not whatever we think of the rest of the protest. And for me, like, I come across very hard-nosed because I'm coming from a very much kind of a hard critical approach to looking at it.
Right.
I think for a lot of people that's incredibly tough, and for some it feels like a personal attack. That's hard. And it's not a personal attack when people say, look, these structures exist, they're fundamentally broken, recuperation happens, and we have to figure out how to get past that if we want a real chance to change the problems that brought us here.
Mm-hmm.
And those things, this is a tough place to be, truly. Like, as much as people want to say this isn't some, you know, somewhat revolutionary moment, it is. And it's revolutionary in that there are a bunch of doors open to us, and if we choose to, we can build something fundamentally better.
I think we are at that point where this is the thing that we can do now. That we are at a point where the future, as you know, Joe Strummer said, the future is unwritten. We are never going to see a better time in our lives where things are more wide open and more open to being changed, because there are so many people out there who are just hungry for that. This is why, like you said, the conspiracy theories take off. This is why, you know, people like the arrest Mike Flynn guy actually have an audience, is because they want people to know that people want to know why this happened. People want to know what this is all about at this point. And we're all kind of fighting for the narrative now. And I think that the people who can say, this is it, this is why, are going to be able to be successful in potentially building something better out of where we're at right now.
I think you nailed it on the head, right? Like, this is a narrative war now, right? And as certain parts of the corporate neoliberal structure really do get exposed as having failed completely, that's going to get louder. We're already seeing it. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Like, that's just how this is going to work, because anything is possible. Because there is now a real chance to say, look, this is a failure. Neoliberalism failed us, and it failed every one of us to the point where it allowed the fascism that Trump represents to grow, blossom, and fruit.
Yeah.
And if we want, we do not have to go back to that route.
No.
And that is a hugely powerful moment, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. it's also a moment where we actually have to do the hard work of standing up for our principles, whether or not that sounds really harsh to certain people.
Yeah.
I can't stop thinking about looking at the polling numbers during the civil rights movement and how some of these groups are reacting to actual systemic change at a real level, because it looks very similar, where a whole lot of moderate white America calls for real change to see people differently.
Yeah.
Bad.
And I think that's what we're seeing right now is a window that's open, that those of us who think we've got some better ideas, and that doesn't necessarily mean, turning everyone communist. That's not necessarily what you're going to see. And I think that's something that pisses a lot of people off. I think that the idea that you're not going to be able to all of a sudden make committed radicals out of some of these people to your cause leads them to say, well, it's not worth doing. And it's like, no, what you might get are just some more humanistic, centrists. You might get some centrists who have a more realistic idea about what the problems are with society, what the problems are with the police, what the problems are with DHS. And that is valid. That is steps miles ahead of where we are now.
Oh God, yes. Well, realistically, like, if you can get people to the point where they're starting to think about like their life in regards to actual positive change based on technocratic governance, I would make the argument that Trump got the Republican vote because of the inability for neoliberalism to account for real positive change on the ground in certain key areas after deindustrialization.
Right.
And well, then that means we have to fix that problem because it'll happen again.
Yeah.
Again.
But we can do it now. I think we are at that point where we can do it now. And I think that we should, all of us that kind of agree on this, and I'm reaching out here, let's maybe agree to stop having some of the dumb, pissy little arguments that are not accomplishing anything in terms of getting people that are new, that are, freshly on board with this. I think people are willing to hear what has been done to protesters in the past. People that are angry because they've been fighting this for years and, have gotten their heads cracked in for it on a number of occasions and gotten mocked and ridiculed. I think people are willing to hear why those people are angry. I think people are willing to say, you know what? You're right. That never should have happened to you. That was unjust. That was unfair. If you want somebody else to step up and take, the brunt of the head kicking in for a while, that's what we're here for now.
Yeah.
I mean, feel free to sit in the back, get your heel on.
Well, it's really, all of this is just going to be kind of call and response, right?
Yeah.
So like we have to kind of be able to hear the call then to provide response and vice versa. And if you flood things out with just personal grievance bullshit versus actual disagreement on maybe some point,
right?
You've lost.
Yeah.
And it's really, I think it's indicative that some of the loudest voices in like the, I guess we could say like neoliberal, moderate, whatever social media sphere aren't willing or able to engage on the merit of an argument. It's immediate ad homs and personal because the goal isn't to actually address the conversation, it's to neuter the ability to have the argument. And we've seen a ton of that this week, right? And I've been getting a lot of it online from certain accounts that really dislike the fact that we're starting to question some of the logic of white moderate neoliberal governance.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting to deal with it because it's very clear there's no want to understand. It's just clearly a MAGA-like response of we want to mock and denigrate the person, not the argument, because if we address the argument, we lose.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been very interesting to watch and experience, because it really does outline that certain parts of the neoliberal view is an incredibly reactionary and unreason based position that sees anyone who can't or won't walk the same corporate ladder as a threat.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to experience that as someone who's dealt with the far right in wild capacities over the years, whether that's getting doxxed or, brigaded, whatever. This is a very different kind of group, because the goal is definitely not to talk about the argument, it's to assassinate the person carrying the argument to the public. And it really outlines how the recuperative effort does work within certain parts of the more, white, moderate, liberal world. And it's also quite clear that it's fucking totally ineffectual now. It's working against them, and it's destroying their ability to actually hold a rational place that people can acknowledge without seeing, oh, you moved positions 19 times.
Yeah.
Because you have no real beliefs. You're empty. You're just someone who wants to say things and feel good about it. That's incredibly interesting to see, right? Like, I generally don't talk about dumb shit like this, but this actually is kind of an important one in that it's showing how the system that they rely on is broken, and it fundamentally isn't based on anything positive. It's based on truly breaking anything that looks like it might require them to lose 1 inch of the world they believe they deserve.